Hey guys, what's going on? So we got a 66 Ford 100 in the garage. It's got a 302 in it, so we're gonna put a new flywheel in it. My buddy Brian and Steve are gonna do the flywheel work. I'll do the video work, and something a little different. This is a pretty cool hot ride. We're gonna dive into this and show you what it's all about. So before we begin on this, Brian and I are gonna walk around the truck real quick. He's been fixing this truck for a customer of his. Had a lot of issues with it. Brian's a wiring genius when it comes to motors. Fueling old Broncos. He's really unbelievable when it comes to that stuff. So Brian, what was going on with this truck that you inherited?
Okay, first off, now that Tony pretends that he actually has smart friends, and now I'm going to act a professional. A friend of mine bought this online, and word of caution, whenever you buy a car online, it looks half as good in person as it does in the pictures. They got bright lights. They just make them look good so they can sell them to you and you don't worry about a thing. Well, that's kind of what happened here. It did look good. The pictures looked good. And even knowing the pictures looked good, looking beyond the pictures, everything looked good. There were some concerns, the wiring, which is usually a small concern. And then, you have to take into account that some things you assume are done right. Well, we got the truck. The wiring was horrendous, so that had to be redone completely. He wanted, Ford fuel injection installed. He didn't want the Holly unit. He wanted it serviceable. So after kind of decoding the engine that's in here, we discovered it's an 86 5-liter out of a Mustang. So it's the high output with the roller cam. And as soon as I started to see some of the problems when they finished this build, the first thing that came into mind was, what flywheel did they put in it? Because it's got a C6 transmission, not a common transmission behind a 5-liter Ford. So sure enough, I was right. They had a 28 imbalance flywheel behind the 50-ounce imbalance 5-liter. So today, we're changing the flex plate for that reason. And hopefully that's going to smooth this engine out because it does run a little rough.
So Brian kind of ran through the engine compartment on this thing and eaten up a bunch of the wires. Looks really good. Everything looks nice and tidy in this old truck. You did a good job.
Thank you. I can show you a few more things if you're interested. So with it being a 5-liter engine, it had V-belt pulleys on it, so I was able to find a nice used serpentine setup. He wanted air conditioning in the truck, so then now you're teeter-tottering. You get the serpentine belt. You want to use the Mustang's AC compressor. So when you do that, obviously the hoses don't work with the vintage air kit. So what I was able to do is take some hoses from the 5-liter Mustang and convert the ends. So this hose right here is a typical 5-liter, and we converted it to the proper type of fitting for the vintage air setup. It allows you to package it a little bit better this way, and it also makes replacing parts down the road a lot easier. The other couple other things we did, fully rewiring it, we put a battery source here. I used fuse links simply because they don't take up much space. I built a fuse box that takes care of the Ford fuel injector relays, and then I also incorporated 2 circuit breakers for the high and low beam circuits. And because of this, all the power is really going to be focused right from the battery and power source. All the cables in number 2 wire, they're welding wire. We used these mil-spec battery posts. I highly recommend these. They are so robust, and I bought some terminal kits with heat shrink right from Amazon, and it was really good quality. Was able to compress those ends on, was able to make all the lines the right length, and in the end, it's a nice clean install. So this should last literally this should last the way this is wired another 40 years.
All right, so let's dive into this clutch. We'll get this guy's flywheel fixed and get this thing up in the air. All
right, let's go. Okay, so we're going to start off by removing the drive shaft. I believe those are 4 half-inch bolts, U-bolts. Then we're going to come up remove the speedometer cable, disconnect the shift linkage, disconnect the vacuum to the modulator valve. We're going to disconnect the transmission lines that go to the transmission for the cooling. The transmission mount and cross member need to come out. Then the bell housing bolts that go into the block will come out. And then on the front, you'll be able to see here in the inspection plate, the bolts to the torque converter, those will be removed as well. Once that's done, I did leave out the starter. The starter does have to come out as well. Once that's done, the transmission should slide back, tip down, and come out of the car.
So we just turned the flywheel, and on this particular flywheel, there are 3 bolts in there. Only 3 bolts. So we just removed those.
There should be 4.
It's like everything else on this truck. We should take like 3 bolts out of the bell housing.
There should be 4. It was before there was 3. There was 4.
So right now we're gonna do the shifted linkage and the transmission lines. So loosen those up, take them off. We've already loosened up the drive shaft. We'll get that removed in a minute, and should be able to take this out pretty soon.
Well, you're gonna have to let a little bit drain out because
So now we're gonna pull the drive shaft, and Brian's gonna put a glove on the tail end of it so the fluid doesn't leak out, right?
he's putting a condom on it.
That's the plan.
Because we practice safe sex here.
Sponsored by John Hancock.
As soon as that'll help prevent the ink there.
Ah, look at that, huh?
There you go. Nice
Look at
tight
that.
seal.
Okay.
Keep that fluid in there.
Did you put one in the dipstick hole?
I did not.
Your dipstick.
We took the dipstick out. We're gonna plug the hole on that. We're gonna jack the back of the transmission up. We're gonna slide the cross member up. And unfortunately, we do not have a transmission jack, but what we have is Tony here. So Tony's gonna help us muscle this thing out.
I'm the video guy. You gotta stand behind this camera.
So if you see this transmission come out on video, it means that Tony was a lazy bastard.
Had no involvement in transmission removal. So this is one thing that we're up against, and when you buy a hot rod that someone's put together, you just kind of don't know sometimes what's been done to it. This truck and this engine and transmission may have been put in as one piece. We started to take the transmission out, and it's sitting the floorboard. But lucky for us, there's enough room to get at the bolts on the flywheel, so we're gonna leave the transmission pulled away from the engine. It's supported, and we're gonna drop the flywheel out. There's plenty of room to get in there, so we're gonna swap it out and put the new one in. So Brian, how many times have you seen stuff like this when building a hot rod? Buying somebody else's hot rod that they built?
Somebody else's hot rod.
that they built.
That's the key.
It's more
Right.
like it.
You know, be warned that whenever you buy something that's custom, that custom means mysterious in many occasions. And one of the things that I do when I do work on cars is try to focus on OEM parts. And an example of that, you know, he wanted fuel injection from Ford. This is the narrow frame F100, and to fit, they took a van gas tank, they cut it in half, re-welded it. It's just a standard gas tank. Didn't have the pickup for the fuel injection in the in-tank pump. This was all a mess. You know, the filler was all a mess. What I did is I ended up spending about 20 hours online, and I found that a 1986 Bronco 2 tank with fuel injection has the provision for the, you know, what is it, 30 to 90 ohm sending unit, the provision for the in-tank pump, and it allows you to have an OEM replacement part on the vehicle. And believe it or not, these straps were actually Bronco 2 straps. I just made a simple modification. Instead of feeding it into the frame, put a hole where the straps doubled, and we used J-bolts all around. So yeah, there's an example. I documented it. The owner of the truck is going to have full documentation on this. If he ever has gas tank problems and he brings it to a shop, he can give them the DNA of it, and it would be super easy to repair.
Yeah. So it's just, you know, going back to the transmission. Yeah, you just don't know sometimes you're going to run into doing these jobs, but we've got to work around, and we'll get this flywheel out of here in a second.
Where's
Of course I can't.
your light? Huh?
I can't
Steve,
get the fucking thing all
Can you
over.
step aside? I don't want to get caught in your kazipit.
So somebody had to crack these loose, and now we're zipping the bolts out with the ratchet. Isn't that right, Steve?
Yeah.
You just thought I was here to meet people. So we got the new flywheel versus old flywheel.
So here's the weight. You know, this is the orientation. You can see that the imbalance is different, especially by this big window here. It helps add weight to this side, but clearly a different flywheel. They sit the same height, and they're also the same diameter. But the crankshaft balance in this car is a 50-ounce imbalance, and most cars before 1980 were a 28-ounce imbalance. And because it's a C6 transmission, it's likely it came out of an earlier truck. So I think what they did is they just took an engine and transmission setup.
That thing came out of a Granada.
C6?
Oh, they had a C4 in them.
If the
Did they have a
C6 was
C-
in the Granada, they would have lasted 2 years, okay? But yeah, so that's why we're doing what we're doing today, and hopefully this is going to make that engine run a lot smoother. It's so bad that you get a rumble between, you know, idle and, you know, 2,500 RPMs. So that's it's very uncomfortable to drive it that way.
So right now we're running down a couple bolts and holes that didn't have bolts anyway. There should have been a bolt to make sure that they're tapped right, Steve?
Yeah, we're just thread chasing them out, and so it was out of the 6 bolts that hold this tranny on, there was 2 that weren't used, and we just ran a tap down to make sure they're not damaged, and we'll get the proper bolt for those 2, grade 8. And Brian is checking the torque converter bolts right now, and I got a tap that I'm going to get so we can run down onto those. 'Cause those are locking ones, right, Brian?
They are locking ones, so we're good. These are moving free.
Right.
And they're brand new bolts. Whenever you do a transmission change or break it down, there are a few bolts that are really good to replace. If you've ever gone into an old car that's been worked on, you pull the inspection cover off, if it has one, on the transmission, and discover, well, there's a missing torque converter bolt. The reason why these have a surface on them that provides pressure as you tighten them, and it locks the bolt in place. And once you start taking them on and off a couple of times, it loses that characteristic. So always buy these bolts. It's $5 for a set of 4, and a great insurance step to take.
The new flywheel up in place. Brian's tightening it up. Let's get everything nice and snugged up in there. So Brian just torqued down the flywheel bolts. Found online, it calls for 75 to 80 foot-pounds. So now we've got to start reassembling everything. Isn't that right, Brian?
That is correct. Want to lift this one up a little?
No, I kind of like the height of it. Okay, we need to like rock this thing this way, just like that.
To you?
Yeah. Come on in. Oh, I'm fucking close.
You want me to lift this one up a little?
Don't do anything yet. Don't do anything.
Hey, looking pretty good.
fucking. That's staying on there.
Looks like that's gonna go up a little over there.
Right there, you're in on this one. Okay, you're in on this one.
So let me get this raised a little.
Right.
You know what? Pull this side in, Steve. Pull this one in. And I think we're good.
So right now we're just catching all the bolts in the bell housing and getting this all put back together. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're putting the cross member back in place. We're gonna bolt the transmission back up to it, get the drive shaft back in place, and get this thing all buttoned up.
All right, so a good friend of mine, he rebuilds transmissions, does transmissions jobs all the time. And one thing he always told me is that the torque converter should never be stressed before bolting it to the flywheel. And I just want to show you what that means. So right now, the transmission's in place, the torque converter's up against the flywheel, no bolts on it. And if you watch, you should be able to move it by hand back and forth freely. That's the way you want the mating to be of the transmission, especially between the flex plate or flywheel and the torque converter. Okay, so we get the drive shaft back in, U-bolts, 1/2-inch nut on them, all torqued up. That's in. As you go to the front, we got the cross member bolted up, back into place, transmission bolt back in. Over here we have the speed sensor reinstalled, shift linkage tightened back up, modulator valve has the vacuum reconnected. We have the transmission lines for the cooling to the radiator. Both of those are connected. Dipstick is back in. It needs to be secured at the top still. We chased the bolts through the engine block to make sure the holes are clean. We need to add 2 more bolts. There were 2 bolts missing. Up in the front, we installed the starter, and the lower bolt was where we did the helical repair. And we have new bolts to the transmission torque converter. And I don't know if you can see that from here, but
Yep.
they're right here.
Yep.
Transmission lines up in the front secured. And I think that's a wrap.
I think it's a wrap.
Ready to start her up.
Sounds pretty good. Thanks for watching, guys.